Now, the Pentagon fights the CIA in Syria. Different militias backed by the two US departments have apparently started fighting each other, and all at the American taxpayers' expense. In February, CIA armed group Khorasan al-Haq, or Knights of Righteousness, were apparently forced out of their positions by the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces backed by the Pentagon. The report comes as President Obama this month authorised a new Pentagon plan to train and arm Syrian anti-government fighters. And here's a reminder of what happened to the old one.
We're also supporting a moderate opposition in Syria that can help us in this effort, who stand up to the bankrupt ideology of violent extremism.
Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five.
Let's not kid ourselves, that's a joke.
We have to acknowledge this is a total failure. It's just a failure.
This train and equip program has not, frankly, lived up to what we initially thought.
Program hasn't lived up to expectations. That's an understatement, isn't it?
With me now to discuss the latest reports, former CIA officer Ray McGovern, who's in Washington, D.C. Ray, welcome. How much control do these two associations, the US military, the US intelligence, have over the groups that they're funding on the ground?
Well, let's start with the good news. The good news is that because of Russian intervention and because of President Obama's sensible reaction to it, namely no longer pressing for priority for removing Assad and also allowing Iranians to participate in negotiations, the ceasefire, or what we call a cessation of hostilities, is holding. Now, the embarrassing part of all this is that when President Putin and President Obama told their respective foreign ministers to deconflict things, make sure that our planes don't run into each other, that has moved forward to the point where there's active military cooperation in Syria. Now, unfortunately, the same is not true of the various factions within the US government, the CIA on the one hand, and the Department of Defense on the other. They don't seem able to deconflict their strategies. And the bottom line here, of course, is there's no one in control. Susan Rice, National Security Advisor, she's going to tell the special operations folks and the Air Force and what to do, and the CIA what to do. So we have the makings of a real, it's almost laughable if it weren't so serious. We have different objectives. First of all, the moderate rebels were going to remove Assad, and then they got instructions, no, don't remove Assad, we're going to go after ISIS. No one knows what to think. And besides that, you just saw that the Pentagon has been thoroughly embarrassed by investing $500 million into fielding 4 or 5 people still in the fight. So the solution is to work with the Russians to make sure that they deconflict not only Russian and US objectives and actions, but that the Russians might even help us deconflict the obvious shooting that's going on between CIA-supported rebels and the Department of Defense-supported rebels. It's really quite an embarrassment, but the good news, let's keep the good news in the forefront here. The cessation of hostility seems to be having legs, and there's one other element here, and that is that if it is true, these recent reports that part of this deal between Lavrov and Kerry involved leaning on the Saudis, leaning on the Turks and the Israelis to stop supplying the rebels, that is really good news. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Ray, thanks for joining us. Our guest is Ray McGovern, former CIA officer from Washington there.